Welcome. You are about to embark on a unique learning adventure from the Great Courses. Our courses are crafted to be entertaining journeys, both comprehensive and fascinating. They're designed to expand horizons, deepen understanding, and foster epiphanies in a broad array of subjects and university-level disciplines. The lecturers are university professors and subject matter experts carefully selected by the Great Courses and its customers for their intellectual distinction and exceptional abilities to teach. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalogs or visit our website at thegreatcourses.com and imagine how much you can learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the company of some of the greatest minds in the world. These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. These lectures are titled Writing Great Fiction, Storytelling Tips and Techniques. Your lecturer is Professor James Hines. Professor Hines is a working novelist who has taught creative writing as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, the University of Michigan, and Grinnell College, among other schools. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from the University of Michigan and a Master of Fine Arts degree from the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Professor Hines is the author of several works of fiction including Next, Kings of Infinite Space, The Lecturer's Tale, The Wild Colonial Boy, and Publish and Perish, Three Tales of Tenure and Terror. His book reviews and literary essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Boston Review, and other publications. Lecture 1. Starting the Writing Process.
Few things make a writer more anxious than facing a blank page. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner starting your first story ever, or if you're a battle-scarred old professional with many publications behind you. Having to fill that blank space with words is almost always a very intimidating prospect. Like any worker faced with a difficult task, a writer can find all sorts of ways to allay that anxiety. These include petty rituals of procrastination, like, say, alphabetizing your bookshelf, experimenting with different fonts on your computer, or sharpening all your pencils to just the right length. Some writers go further, indulging in such self-destructive practices as using alcohol or drugs to numb their anxiety. And ever since the advent of the internet, there's been a vast middle ground between these two extremes, now that a writer is able to kill almost all his writing time by checking his email, making wisecracks on Twitter, or watching adorable kittens on YouTube and calling it research. A more fruitful approach is to stop and think about what the opening of a story is supposed to do, and that's pretty simple. The beginning of a story is supposed to make the reader want to keep reading. It's supposed to draw readers in, capture their curiosity, make them want to find out more. The beginning should also suggest something important about the story, who the main characters are, what the tone is, where the story is set, anything, as long as it hooks the reader and turns out to be important later on. The opening, in other words, should be evocative of the rest of the story as a whole. But even knowing this doesn't necessarily allay the writer's anxiety. Even if you know the story that you want to tell, how do you know where to enter into it? How do you take that first step? How do you decide what that first paragraph, that first sentence, that first word should be? Let me suggest some ways to make the beginning seem less foreboding. Or, to put it another way, let me show you how to sneak up on the beginning. One way to do this is to break the question of how shall I begin into 3 separate questions. I'll call these the artistic question, the logistical question, and the psychological question. The artistic question is simply, what is my story about? What's the idea, the seed, the itch I want to scratch for the next few weeks or months if you're writing a short story, or for the next year or 2 or 3 if you're writing a novel? This is the sine qua non of artistic creation. You wouldn't even be facing a blank page if you didn't have an idea you wanted to express. But this doesn't mean that you know everything about your story yet. You may not know who all the characters are, or what happens to them, or how it ends. But at least you know the ineffable thing you wanted to write a story about in the first place. You might have an entire plot worked out in your head already, or you might have only a character, or a situation, or even just an image you want to explore. But at the very least, you have something that has put you face to face, so to speak, with the blank page. The next question, then, is the logistical question. This question is about the technical aspects of starting a story, the nuts and bolts stuff, all the basic decisions you have to make right at the start, even if you don't know everything about your story. And this question is actually a lot of questions, all rolled up together. Answering these questions, at least in part, involves making specific technical choices right off the bat, such as deciding who's telling the story, what verb tense to use, what voice the story is in, and so on. Even if you already have a clear idea of what your story is, these early choices can be daunting, because every decision you make will turn out to have consequences later on, many of which you can't foresee. Then, finally, there's the psychological question, or to put it another way, the question of how you gear up emotionally to begin. Even those of us who have written before get anxious about starting, maybe even especially those of us who have done it before, because we already know what a long, arduous, taxing, sometimes exhilarating, but often nerve-shredding process writing can be. All 3 of these questions, of course, are inextricably intertwined, and trying to leap that psychological hurdle involves being able to answer the first 2 questions, at least in part. And that, in turn, ratchets up the anxiety, because there's so much stuff you could worry about in advance that it's a wonder anybody ever starts at all. As William Faulkner once famously said, writing a novel is like a one-armed man trying to hammer together a chicken coop in a hurricane. The first 2 questions, the artistic and the logistical, are especially intertwined, so let's talk about them together. So what do you need to know about a story before you start? Some people start with more or less fully formed plot in their heads. In one edition of The Last Tycoon, the unfinished novel that F. Scott Fitzgerald left behind him when he died, the last portion of the book is made up of Fitzgerald's detailed outline for the plot, in which he not only indicated how many chapters the book would have and what happens in each chapter, but how many words each chapter was going to be. All of this worked out before he even started writing. At the other extreme, some writers start with only an image or a character and then just wing it for 100,000 words. To invoke William Faulkner once again, he once said that when he started work on his greatest novel, The Sound and the Fury, all he had was an image of a little girl wearing muddy underpants hiding in a tree. Yet out of that image, through the process of figuring out who that little girl was, how she dirtied her drawers, and what she was doing up a tree, he created a work as rich, complex, and profound as any novel in American literature. Another way to approach starting a work of fiction is by using the good old-fashioned 5 W's of journalism: who, what, where, when, and why. This technique is very old, dating back to the rhetoricians and philosophers of the ancient and medieval world, who used a Latin version of the 5 W's, quis, quid, ubi, quando, cur, to help frame an argument or structure the exegesis of a text. Most of us recall them from high school or from a college journalism class, where the 5 W's are used to structure a simple newspaper story. What is the story about? What happened? Where did it take place? When did it take place? Why did it happen? Let's adapt the 5 W's to thinking about a piece of fiction, turning them into questions a writer might ask him or herself before embarking upon a new project. Assuming you have a rough idea of what you want to write about, this is another simple but powerful exercise that you might find helpful in getting started. Take out your notebook or your laptop and open to a blank page and just write down who, what, where, when, and why. And again, without thinking too hard about it, answer each question as it pertains to the story you want to tell. Here are a few things to think about before you begin. The first question is, who are your characters, and how are they related to each other? The who question also encompasses the choice of point of view, that is, who is your protagonist or main character, and who is your narrator. Sometimes the narrator and the protagonist are the same person. For example, Jane Eyre is both the narrator and the protagonist of the Charlotte Bronte novel that bears her name. But sometimes the protagonist and the narrator are not necessarily the same person. In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the protagonist is Captain Ahab, the obsessed whaling captain who wants to kill the great white whale that bit off his leg. But the book is narrated by Ishmael, who was a member of Ahab's crew. And of course, in many cases, a story is not narrated by any of the characters in the story, but is told by a third-person narrator who can vary from the godlike, seeing into each character's thoughts the way George Eliot does in Middlemarch, to a narrator who's more like a surveillance camera, merely relating what the characters do without revealing their inner lives, the way Dashiell Hammett does in The Maltese Falcon. This is a tricky choice, but also an important one, because who tells your story determines in large part how you answer the next question, which is, what happens in the story? What do your characters do over the course of the story? Another larger interpretation of the what question is, what is your story about? Do you have some larger idea or theme you want to get across? Or are you just telling a ripping yarn with no deeper meaning? Even if it's only the latter, you still have to think about another version of the what question, namely, what effect do you want the story to have on the reader? Do you want to make the reader laugh, cry, be afraid, get angry, or all of the above? The where question seems relatively simple at first glance. Where is the story set? But it leads to a more complex question. How important is the setting to the story? Some stories are very specifically related to a particular time and place. For example, Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway is uniquely tied to the city of London in the years right after World War I. But in some cases, it's possible to transfer the plot of a great novel from one setting to another and still have it tell recognizably the same story. The plot and characters of Jane Austen's novel Emma, for example, were successfully transferred from England in the early 19th century to Los Angeles in the late 20th century in the film comedy Clueless. And Homer's Odyssey, one of the defining stories of Western civilization, has been retold many times in many settings, from James Joyce's great modernist novel Ulysses, set in Dublin on a single day in 1904, to the Coen brothers film, O Brother, Where Art Thou?, set in the American South during the Great Depression. So, when you answer the question, where is the story set, you have to decide if your story is tied to a specific geographical and historical context, and if it is in part about that place and time, or if it is more archetypical and timeless. The next question, when does the story take place, is likewise more complex than it seems at first. When can mean something as simple as, when in history does the story take place? In other words, does it take place in the present day, or 200 years ago, or 200 years in the future? More importantly, though, is the question, when does the story take place in the lives of the characters? Are they young, middle-aged, or old? And most importantly, when is the story being told in relation to when it took place? In other words, is it being narrated in the present tense as it happens, or is it being narrated in the past tense by a present-day narrator who is remembering something that happened in the past? A strong present tense narration, as in many of the short stories of Raymond Carver, lends a story immediacy. But more often, you have a first-person narrator remembering something that happened in the past. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, the story is told by the main character, Scout, in the past tense, with the implication that she is now a grown woman remembering events that happened decades before, when she was a girl. Among other things, this allows the author to show the events from the point of view of a child, while at the same time allowing the narrator to present things from an adult perspective, allowing her to explain things now that she wouldn't have understood when they were actually happening. If you tell a story in the past tense, you gain the benefit of hindsight, since it's told by someone who already knows how the story turns out. But if you decide to tell it in the present tense, what you lose in hindsight, you might gain in immediacy and suspense. Another aspect of the when question is, at what point in the story does the plot begin? How do you order the events of the plot? Do you tell the story chronologically, as most conventional stories and novels do, or do you tell it backwards? In the play Betrayal, the British writer Harold Pinter tells the story of an adulterous affair by starting with the bitter end of the relationship and then working back through the course of the affair, scene by scene, until he ends with the first meeting of the lovers. Or do you jump all over the place chronologically, the way Joseph Conrad does in his novel Lord Jim, interspersing the present day of the story with flashbacks from various stages in the lives of his characters? Answering this question is at the heart of learning how to construct the plot, because you come to realize that the same series of chronological events can be told in a surprisingly large number of different ways. By deciding what to reveal and when, you're deciding what the most important moments in the plot are. Finally, we have the why question. Why do the characters do what they do? What does each character want? As actors say, what are their motivations? And why are they in the situation they're in? Is it a situation of their own making, as in a lot of American middle-class novels of middle-class life? Or is the character's situation thrust upon them or out of their control, forcing them to deal with it as best they can? Many of the great realist novels of the 19th and 20th centuries, by such writers as the Frenchman Émile Zola and the American Edith Wharton, are about characters caught in the coils of social or economic circumstance, struggling to survive in a world they can't control. Of course, asking why the characters do what they do is both the hardest and the most essential question that you have to answer. And it's not going too far to say that for a lot of writers, maybe even for most of them, answering this question is why they write the novel or story to begin with. To illustrate how the answers to all of these questions might help you get started, let's take a simple story as an example. Let's say we have two characters, Sarah and Brad, who are married to each other. One Friday night, they decide to take in a baseball game. Because I'm a native Michigander, let's say this takes place in Detroit. So they go to see the Tigers play. And during the middle of the seventh inning stretch, Sarah turns to Brad and says, "I'm really unhappy." Now, up to this point, Brad has been having a good time, so he's a little surprised. But it's late in the game, so he says, "Relax, there's only a couple more innings." And that's when Sarah says, "No, you don't understand. I'm really unhappy. I want a divorce." Now, this seems, on the face of it, to be a simple story. You start with two characters in a specific setting, and you tell what happened in chronological order. But then, the climax is a surprise. As soon as Sarah says that she wants a divorce, the story turns out to be more complicated than it seemed at first. Not only that, but the story turns out to have started before the beginning. Sarah's wanted to leave Brad for a long time, but she was afraid to tell him. So she waited until they were at the game when she knew he'd be happy, or at least groggy with beer and hot dogs, before she lowered the boom. So right away, we understand something about the complex dynamic of the two characters. That Sarah is either afraid of Brad, or manipulative, or both, and that Brad is possibly insensitive or has been deliberately ignoring Sarah's unhappiness. And we learn all this before we get into the long-standing reasons why Sarah is unhappy. There are a couple of lessons to be learned from this example. One is that a story is not mere chronology. Some stories are chronological, but many are not. You might even say that most are not, that most stories rely on backstory. In his famous series of lectures about fiction writing, Aspects of the Novel, the British novelist E.M. Forster made a distinction between story and plot. Story, according to Forster, is just the chronological listing of events. His example of a story is the king died and then the queen died. A plot, on the other hand, according to Forster, is a story plus causality and motivation. The king died and then the queen died of grief. Another way of looking at this is to consider that all stories begin in medias res, which is a Latin phrase which means in the middle of things. Even stories that seem to begin at the very beginning begin in medias res, the most famous example being the opening of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This may not seem like it begins in medias res. You can't get much more in the beginning than in the beginning. But if you think about it, you realize that even Genesis begins in medias res because it presumes a previously existing character, namely God. This leads to a larger philosophical point about fiction. As my 9th grade English teacher, Mrs. Giltner, liked to tell us, literature is the creation of order out of chaos and the creation of meaning out of meaninglessness. Stories may feel natural, but stories do not occur in nature. Real life does not happen in stories. Stories are arbitrary. As writers, we imagine a series of events, or we take them out of our life or somebody else's. We order them in a certain way. We choose to highlight some facts and ignore others, and we bring these events and characters to a conclusion or a resolution. The crudest kind of resolution is some sort of victory or defeat, while the more subtle variety leads to a character's deeper understanding of him or herself, or to the reader's deeper understanding of the character, often in a moment that James Joyce called an epiphany. The fact that even a very simple-seeming story can turn suddenly sticky, complicated, and messy in a matter of a few words brings us right back to the difficulty of deciding where to begin. We know the basic facts of Sarah and Brad. They've been married for a while. She's been unhappy. He didn't notice it or chose to ignore it. She's decided to tell him in a public setting. But now, in order to explore this situation, we have to start making choices about what's important to tell, what's not, whose point of view to tell it from, and where in the story, which is to say when in the story, to begin. So let's go back to the 5 W's and see if we can apply them usefully to Sarah and Brad in the way I suggested in the exercise above. Who? Sarah and Brad, who are married to each other. What? They are attending a Tigers baseball game, and one of them wants to get divorced while the other one doesn't know it yet. A whole novel could easily be developed from answering this question, working backwards and forwards through their lives. Where? A crowded baseball stadium in Detroit, Michigan. When? The present day, but also some years into a marriage that one of them thinks is less successful than the other one does. Also, for the sake of argument, let's say they're in their late 30s. Why? Sarah wants out. That's the main motivating factor in the story, so far as we know. It may change later on, as we learn more about the characters and their situation. Then the next question becomes, whose story is it? Which is another way of asking, from whose point of view are we seeing the story? Is it Sarah's story, or Brad's, or both, alternating between the two? Or do we go all godlike in 19th century, looking with perfect understanding on both of our characters from above, the way George Eliot does in Middlemarch? Now, even if you've decided on your 5 W's, you still have to break the ice. You still have to think of those very first words, the very beginning of the story. Do you open with a description that sets the scene? The lights of Tiger Stadium were glowing against the night sky. Or do you open with an exchange of dialogue? Let's see if we can get closer to the dugout, said Brad. Do we have to? Said Sarah. Do you open with interior monologue? He looks so happy, thought Sarah, but I'd rather be anywhere but here. Or do you begin with action? Clutching Sarah's hand, Brad dragged her down the stadium steps closer to the dugout. Or do you open with a combination of all of the above? The scoreboard of Tiger Stadium was brilliant against the black sky over the backfield fence. Brad clutched Sarah's hand and dragged her down the stadium steps closer to the dugout. You're hurting me, said Sarah, squeezing between two huge guys who were already drunk. Sorry, said Brad over his shoulder. He relaxed his grip without letting her go. He looks so happy, Sarah thought, but I'd rather be anywhere but here. How do you pick between all these choices? How do you decide without hamstringing yourself, knowing that every choice you make will have consequences later on? One possible solution is to outline the whole story in advance. You could sit down before you start writing and map out the entire thing. Writing the story then just becomes the process of filling in the blanks. Some people work very fruitfully this way. It's sort of how I wrote my novel, Kings of Infinite Space. I never had an actual written outline, but I mulled over the book in my head for a couple of years before I ever wrote a word, and then I wrote it very quickly, in 8 months, because I already knew everything that happened in it. But on the whole, just using myself as an example here, I prefer to work without an outline, as in my novel Next. When I started writing that book, I only knew a couple of things to begin with and then just improvised, making everything up as I went along. This suggests a different way of starting than what I've been talking about so far. Rather than letting the rest of the book determine the beginning, let the beginning determine the rest of the book. Then the book becomes more of an exploration, and the experience of writing it becomes more like the experience of reading it. You discover the story the same way a reader does. Most books, I suspect, fall somewhere between these two poles, tending one way or the other, but still not entirely one or the other. At any rate, it's clear that starting a story involves making a lot of choices, and that in turn can ratchet up your anxiety, which brings us at last to the third question I mentioned at the start, the psychological question. And rather than sharpening our pencils or administering a liberal dose of Jack Daniels or Xanax or both, let's sneak up on this last question the way we snuck up on the first two. Rather than dwelling on all the things you do need to worry about, let's consider what you don't need to do, or what you don't need to know when you're starting a story. First of all, you don't have to start at the beginning. Writing a story is not necessarily linear. You don't have to write it the way the reader is going to read it. It can be more like a puzzle, putting a puzzle together. You can start anywhere, and then, when the larger picture gets clearer, you can craft a beginning to it. Second, as a corollary to this, you don't have to know how the story ends. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes knowing is a good thing because it gives you a point to aim at. But sometimes it isn't, because you discover along the way that the story doesn't want to go where you want it to go. Third, you don't have to have an outline, and even if you do, you don't have to stick to it. Be prepared for happy accidents. As I said earlier, for me, writing a novel is a process of exploration. Part of the reason I write is to figure out what I think about something. Though, of course, many fine writers already know what they think when they start, and they write to make a point. Fourth, it doesn't have to be good to begin with. One of the mottos I've shared with students over the years comes from the rock and roll musician Nick Lowe. Early in his career, Lowe also worked as a producer for other artists, and he worked so quickly in the studio that someone gave him the nickname Basher, because his motto for making recordings was, bash it out now and tart it up later. As a writer, you have the luxury of being able to do as many drafts of a story or a novel as it takes to get it right. Or if you don't do drafts, and some writers don't, you can revise as you go along. Don't be afraid to start over or to go back and fix something no matter where you are in the process. Now, the best teachers, of course, are the ones who teach by example. And in this opening lecture, I have been practicing what I've been preaching. At the beginning of this lecture, I said that a good opening should suggest what the rest of the story is about, or at least hint at what might be important later on. And for the past 25 minutes, I've done more than just hint at what's coming. I've essentially fast-forwarded through the entire course, hitting most, if not all, of the main topics I want to talk about in more detail in the next 23 lectures. In the lecture after this one, I want to talk about the concept of evocation, which I think is at the heart of all fiction. The next 15 lectures will be divided into 4 blocks. The first one will be about what a fictional character is, how characters work in fiction, and some strategies for creating them. Next will come 2 lectures about the technical and artistic aspects of writing dialogue. Then I'll talk for 6 lectures about the various types of plot and how to create them, and after that, I'll devote 3 lectures to the different points of view available to the writer. Each of the last 7 lectures will be devoted to a special topic, including how to create and use setting, how to pace a narrative, and how to develop a scene. We'll also be talking about what a draft is, how to approach revision, and how to incorporate research into a story or novel. Finally, I'll end this particular long narrative with a talk about what it means to live and work as a writer. In that last lecture, I will be half evangelist and half drill sergeant, striking a balance between inspiration and realism. One last word before we embark on this journey together. Having invoked evangelism just now, I want to stress that nothing I've already said or that I'm going to say is gospel. Creative writing isn't a science where there are rules or right or wrong answers. The only rule in creative writing is whatever works. A different teacher will tell you different things about all the topics I'm going to explore. And if you caught me on a different occasion, I might say different things about them myself. What I'll be offering you throughout is a set of choices, and the best way you can use these lectures is to think about the various choices I'll present, about creating character, developing a plot, or building a scene, and then adapt those possibilities to your own work, taking whatever is useful and ignoring the rest. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the concept of evocation, which is the fancy Latinate word behind what creative writing teachers mean when they say, show, don't tell. We'll be looking at examples of both showing and telling from the work of Stephen King and the French novelist Irene Nemirovsky. In the meantime, Here's an exercise where you can compare using an outline, the way F. Scott Fitzgerald did, with starting with an image and just winging it, the way William Faulkner did. Without thinking too hard about it, try to recall a vivid image you may have seen recently in your real life or on television, and see if you can imagine a story to explain it. You can start with the Faulkner technique by simply describing the image. Say you saw a mother yelling at her child in the supermarket, and then branching off from there by explaining why the mother is so exasperated or why the child is being so difficult. Or you could use Fitzgerald's technique with the same image by outlining the life of the mother so far, her girlhood, her courtship, the birth of her child, and work up to the moment in the supermarket. Try them both and see which one works best for you, and I'll see you next time.